над облачком явір похилений, співать на нім пташок примилений. Слухай, мила, як то
Good morning. Is on? Yes. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, and it's my pleasure to preside over this panel on leadership, which is being sponsored by Ian Ignatovic, who I think is here. You have a very strong panel to talk on this subject. I will go from right to left. Gerard Seitz is the professor at Ivey Business School at Western University in London, Ontario, and he's also the director of the Institute for Leadership there. You should have a bio on all of our speakers, so I'm not going to do more than a brief description of each. Next to Gerard is Slava Johnson, who's the president and CEO of the West NIS, meaning Newly Independent States Enterprise Fund, longtime lawyer and investor in Ukraine. Next to Slava is Simon Anholt, a noted author and the developer, the creator of the concept of a good country, which he will describe on the panel, which is a way people can improve the global living environment. And then next to Simon on my right is Sofia Opatska, who is the vice rector for academic affairs at the Catholic University in Lviv. And so we will start. And we will go not quite in the order I went, but just follow me. I think you'll see it all makes sense. So I'll start with Slava. Slava, the Western Enterprise Fund, has been a main sponsor of the Ukrainian Leadership Academy. Could you talk about that, please, and why you've gotten involved in this?
Well, let me say a few words initially about the Western NIS Enterprise Fund. It's an unusual organization in that it was established in the early 90s as one of 10 as one of 10 country-specific enterprise funds that were founded by the U.S. Congress. And the whole point of these funds was to revitalize and support small and medium entrepreneurship in former communist countries where entrepreneurship was forbidden. So the enterprise funds were unique in the sense that they were private organizations established by law, but we were, the board of directors were appointed by the President of the United States, and we were given funding from the US government. Our fund received $150 million in startup capital, and we were to work in Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus. I was appointed by President Clinton to the board. The fund worked in Ukraine since that time in two capacities. From 1995 to 2018, we invested in $187 million in 127 small and medium enterprises. The 187 is the startup capital plus free flows. Since 2015, we were permitted by the U.S. government to expand our activities into social investment technical assistance to Ukraine. We were always committed to education because when we had a portfolio of companies, we realized we had to train company directors in values, in governance, organization, and personnel management. And as you can imagine, it was hard to teach older people to change, but we have mixed results. And we realized that in the future we have to focus on younger people, train younger people rather than that first generation of business leaders. So when the revolution of dignity occurred in 2014, what happened in Ukraine, there was an enormous interest among the young in civic engagement. And many of these young people protested and fought and even died to assure their path to Europe. But some of them were really reluctant to stay in Ukraine and still decided that their future really was outside Ukraine. So those people were oriented on leaving, and we wanted to stem that flow. The Enterprise Fund learned about leadership activities from Israel. The Israelis have had a program for over two decades called the Mechina program, which focuses on training young Israelis to become committed and patriotic citizens. That program has produced 60,000 Israeli citizens who are now leaders in government, the military, the professions, and society and business as well. So inspired by the Israeli model, we created the Ukrainian Leadership Academy as an NGO in Ukraine, and we funded a pilot project in 2015. We had the support of Ukrainian intellectuals, academics, and business people and civic people. So we adapted the Israeli model and kind of developed a new curriculum for an intensive 10-month program in leadership. 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. Now, the whole point of the program was to teach the next generation of young people the necessary leadership skills to become responsible adults, to be responsible for themselves, for their families, for their communities, and for Ukraine, and to, in the process, implement the necessary social change. We canvass the best high schools, urban and rural high schools in Ukraine, and we select 17 to 19-year-old students for the program. These students come from all parts of Ukraine, regardless of regional, religious, socioeconomic, linguistic backgrounds. And each of our 6 campuses has a mix of students because we want the students to overcome the stereotypes that people have about people living in other regions of Ukraine or speaking another language. And we also feel that this creates cohesion that will actually unify the country ultimately. So this has been our goal. We've also managed to hire the best teachers in Ukraine to teach at these academies. As I said, we had six campuses now throughout Ukraine. After 3 years, we have 408 alumni, and currently we have 246 students enrolled in our 6 campuses. All costs of tuition and attendance are borne by the fund.
Okay, thank you very much. Gerard, you're a great, in fact, a world-class expert on leadership in business. You teach courses on leadership in the business school. Why is it necessary to do this, and what traits are you looking for in leaders in business?
Okay, thank you, John, for that question. Our focus on leadership really started, or my focus on leadership really started in 2008 as a direct result of the global financial crisis. And if there's one thing that we've learned from that crisis is that good leadership is always a function of competencies, character, and commitment to do the hard work of leadership. I must tell you, though, that when it comes to character or leader character, this is not something that organizations and business schools talked about a lot. But it came up repeatedly in all these conversations. And so we really had no idea as to what leader character really is, what it looks like, and how it can be developed. And so that really started a 10-year research program, so to speak, in which we try to provide some initial answers. Now, simply not academics who try to come up with these answers. We really engage the community of leaders from the public, private, and not-for-profit sector to engage them in the conversations around leader character and what it is. So based on the results of over 2,500 interviews and data points, we formulated this leader character framework that consists of 11 what we call leader character dimensions or virtues, right? So things like drive, collaboration, humility, humanity, integrity, accountability, temperance, justice, accountability, courage, transcendence, and eventually judgment, all 11, right? And so we have built that into our curriculum, the way we teach and talk leadership. But the main issue, of course, is you and I can talk a lot about leadership and leader character, but for leader character to really develop in people, you cannot simply talk about this. It's wonderful, it's a low-risk activity, but you have to really feel it. So one of the things that we've done at the Ivy Business School through the Institute is have developed a partnership with current and former members of the Canadian Forces. We have developed this 5-day off-site course. We take each year 40 students, right? And we subject them to a quite intensive leadership course where we introduce all kinds of stressful events, mental, physical, emotional. And students are put into teams of 10. Students will be both leaders and followers at specific times, right? And the focus really is on developing their leader character, so to speak. So over those 5 days, we have developed a number of exercises or activities where we really stress test individuals, where they have to rely on their collaboration, their humanity, their integrity, right? Their temperance. And so we have a great number of debriefings after all of those exercises. You know, students are required to write a fairly comprehensive paper to really do the deep excavation around what it means to lead with leader character. Because quite frankly, when we think about the global financial crisis, this was not so much a crisis of competencies or commitment. Incredibly smart people working incredibly hard, but in the end, it were character deficiencies that led to this particular crisis, right? I think in the banking or the financial sector, for example, we've seen people with great courage, incredible drive, but the lack of temperance led to some really reckless behavior. So we try to, in our curriculum, to make this very explicit, right? That good leadership is always a function of competencies, character, and commitment, and this needs to be central in the leadership programs we teach at any school.
Okay, thank you very much. Simon, you've developed this extraordinary concept of the good country, which in a sense plays off the point that Gerard just meant, that you have to look at activities in terms of not just their national impact, but their global impact. So could you please describe the good country and why it's important?
Sure, with pleasure. Well, there's a connection, obviously, between the leadership characteristics that are required of our leaders today and the good country concept. So I'll start there. I suppose the concept at the heart of the good country is this idea that leaders today have a double mandate. Traditionally, anybody in a position of power or authority had a simple single mandate. They were responsible for their own people and their own slice of territory. And their job was to do as much as they could for their own people and their own territory. And if in order to do that good, they harmed somebody else's people or somebody else's territory, well, that was even better because it showed how tough they were. Obviously, in an age of advanced globalization and massive interdependency, this principle is close to suicide. So my argument is that today, leaders have a dual mandate. They're responsible for their own people, yes, and to some extent for every man, woman, child, and animal on the planet, whether they like it or not. And they're responsible for their own slice of territory, yes, but to some extent also to every square inch of the Earth's surface and the atmosphere above it, whether they like it or not. And if they don't like it, they're not leaders. So it would be presumptuous in the extreme for me to add a 12th characteristic to your 11th after only having heard it 30 seconds ago. It's beautiful. But I would humbly suggest that intercultural competence is also a requirement of good leadership today, no matter how domestic your role, because there's no such thing as domestic anymore. Everything you do has an international impact. So shall I just try and do in 35 seconds the good country?
Or even 2 minutes.
Oh, wonderful. I thought I was getting that death stare that says you've run over your time.
I want to direct you precisely.
Okay, all right. Well, so the idea, there's a good country and there's the good country. A good country is a country that basically follows these principles, that understands that in the modern age, it's not an independent island sufficient unto itself. It is part of an international community. And the people who run countries join the team that runs the planet, whether they like it or not. And so a good country is a country that somehow manages to harmonize its domestic and its international responsibilities. And the good news is that this doesn't involve self-sacrifice or altruism. The idea of a nation becoming self-sacrificing is preposterous. No nation could, would, or should do that. But there is a way of making policy, as I've discovered as a policy advisor over the last 20 years, that enables you to harmonize the domestic and the international needs in a way that produces better policies. So if you look at domestic policy making, and this applies to corporations as much as it does to countries, through an international lens, a global perspective, you will find that gradually over time, the quality of your policy making just improves. It's not a sacrifice, it's not a compromise. So that's what a good country is. And around about this time tomorrow, I'm going to be announcing the results of this year's Good Country Index, which is an annual study that looks at what each country on earth contributes to the world outside of its own borders. The good country is our attempt to create a model country in this form. And it's a virtual country, it has no territory, which is quite good news. Territory is a nuisance. If you have territory, you need an army to defend it, and then everything goes downhill from there. We estimate that we are going to have a population of about 760 million people from all over the world, which will make us the third largest nation after India and China. We opened our doors for citizenship in September. Within 48 hours, we had citizens from 65 countries. We're now 165 countries, adding citizens every day. And it's going to be a true country. We're going to make policies that benefit the international community. A country, the first country in history, whose national interest is the international interest. It would take me 4 hours to explain the whole thing, but that's a taste.
Okay, wonderful. Sophia, what I'd like to do is have you address changes in the attitude of business leaders in Ukraine over the past several years. Gerard made the point, looking at the financial crisis of 10 years ago, that it was a problem of character. Ukraine is a country where people often talk about the role of oligarchs and the priority of private interest in a very narrow form over public interest. So if you could address that. But I just want to make one more point. It seems to me that in the financial crisis, what we saw were business leaders, to use a phrase that is not uncommon, privatizing profit, but making risk a public matter. And that's one way of describing the problem of past Ukrainian business practices. So what's happened, what you're addressing in Ukraine, is not something unique to Ukraine. With that, please.
Thank you. Well, that's an honor to be on this panel, and maybe in the beginning I would like to say that our university, Ukrainian Catholic University, has very strong institution inside Lviv Business School, and which gives us quite a good understanding what Ukrainian business people are thinking about, how they feel, and how they think about developing their business. And we are the only business school in Ukraine which also has a leadership center, and we have privilege to partner with the Ivy Business School, and we actually use the same model, and in last couple of years we have been able to share this model and to raise awareness about character leadership with very many people, and not only with business people, but also people who study at public administration program or NGO program. Maybe one more thing before I respond to your question. Ukraine is at the moment a country which has to defend its territory, and I think it puts very special moment on everyone in the country. And I think maybe those difficult crisis moments, they also take the best out of us and probably make us reflect on very many things. So I think after what changed I see in business people who come to business school in last couple of years is that after Revolution of Dignity, they started to think a little bit more longer term. And if we think about leadership, it's not an instrument. It's not a quick, pill which you can, vitamin which you can put into your glass, drink, and, tomorrow you're a better leader than you were today. It's a long transformational process. And to be eager to do transformation with yourself, to be eager to do transformation with your organization, you need to have longer-term vision. You really need to think for a couple of years or maybe even decades, which is not that often, in business environment at the moment. So what really changed, I think business started to be much more engaged in public discussion in Ukraine in last couple of years. The business started to work much more with civil society, and it all puts quite new expectations to business people as well. They, if they want to see better leaders of the country, they have to be better leaders for their organizations. And I think this kind of reflection went through heads of very many people in Ukraine, leading companies. Another thing is that many more Ukrainian companies started to look globally. If until 2014, many of them were focusing on CIS markets, working with neighbors. Right now, they are looking much more into European or global markets. And if you want to work with global partners, you very often you need to develop completely new virtues in yourself. You need to think about collaboration. You need to think much more and develop much more sense of judgment. So it started to put completely new, again, expectations to business people in, and I think the response is pretty good. Of course, it's not completely positive, and everywhere we can see positive examples, negative examples, but I can talk mostly about community which is around business school, and I would say that focus and priority of business people who come to our school changed much more from competences and hard things. People are still come to business school to get those, but they are looking for much more important things: sense, meaning, longer term thinking, reflection, and virtues which were mentioned by Gerard.
Just one quick follow-up, and then we'll turn back to the other panel members. Do you think that there is greater understanding in the business community that they cannot rely on special access to public resources for success?
Well, I think people who are looking for longer-term business operation and think about sometimes business for generations, they are quite interested in competition, because competition makes all of us much better. And I think that we see more and more of this type of business people around right now. By the way, I did not answer about oligarchs. I will give very quick. Can I give quick response? It's interesting because I had a class recently with undergraduate students, not in the business school, not with the executives, but with undergraduate students. And I asked them, do they know who is Firtash? Believe it or not, they did not know who is Firtash. So I think, but whom they know our faculty member who gave his life at Maidan, who was shot there, and through whose plaque they walk every single day in the university. And I think this gives us much more optimistic view for the future, because those are people who are going through leadership academy, through young people who go for undergraduate programs in the best universities. They have completely different set of mind, and I think it will take. Of course, it will take some time, but they will bring big change into our country.
Okay, thank you. Simon, I'd like to turn back to you right now. First, to give you two questions. The first one you may have already answered, but regarding how you see business leadership in terms of the good country concept. You gave the soundbite answer saying these are people who are beyond the narrow interests of their company. But if you can go a little bit more into that, and then I'll come back to Ukraine and business from your perspective.
Yes, of course, and I think it also links very strongly to this question of competition. I also agree that competition is a valuable thing, and it's one of the bases of human nature, and it's also one of the bases of business. It has also traditionally been the basis of the international system. Since the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia, the nation has been conceived of as a selfish, self-interested economic tribe whose job is to screw the other tribes as quickly as possible. And this is, of course, fatal. So I think it would be a very good moment in history for us to reconsider the universal utility of competitiveness. We can't get rid of it, and we shouldn't try, because it is a great driver of progress and growth. I think competition becomes a problem when it's the only altar at which we worship. And I think that has been the global system for 80 or 100 years now. And it's time, I think, we learned a little bit of wisdom that says that mingling competition and collaboration is a much more sophisticated way of behaving. It comes naturally to some cultures. I don't know about the Ukraine, but typically the Nordic region is the one that seems to find this easiest. They collaborate and they compete. And the link to business, of course, is a very clear one. Business showed the way back in the 1970s, actually in the 1670s, but I won't go there right now, when the automotive industry learnt from the Japanese automotive industry back in the 70s that you could do this thing called co-opetition, and it would be a rising tide that lifted all ships. And I think this is an incredibly valuable insight, that you can compete and collaborate at the same time. The age of gigantic global crises that we're living through at the moment, climate change, population growth, weapons proliferation, human rights, and so on and so forth, all of these problems, by definition, are bigger than any one country. We can only resolve them through broad international cooperation and collaboration. So this isn't just a nice to have, this is a must have. So I would argue that we need to take this principle of co-opetition, which has been pretty advanced in the business sector, and apply it to governance overall. Take a look at what that means for countries. And they might just discover that working together, they not only solve their own problems better, but they solve the collective problems of humanity much faster.
Okay, thank you. I want to jump to Gerard and then come to Slava. Simon again made some very interesting points about the importance of a broad understanding for global prosperity. Applying that to business. Correct me if I'm wrong, Gerard. You're the expert. I'm the amateur. But the 2008 financial crisis, it seems to me, was in large part a result of very powerful business leaders maximizing profit for themselves over, you could say, the public good. If I'm wrong, correct me. Okay. How can you establish a system in which it is to their disadvantage to do that? Right? To their disadvantage. I mean, look, people are not promoted, again, correct me if I'm wrong, because they're a nice guy or because they funded that community project in the inner city in some urban setting, but because they drew in big profits for their firm, right? So with that as the basis for success, how do you establish a system in which you take into account the greater good as Simon described it?
Well, John, if I had the answer to that, I would be a highly paid consultant, right?
I'll give you the answer after.
Okay.
Or philosopher king.
Or a philosopher. But I would say this. I think, have we learned a lot from the global financial crisis? I'm not that sure, number one. Number two, I think a lot of business leaders are actually waking up. Larry Fink, the CEO from BlackRock, not an insignificant organization, in 2018 wrote a very influential letter to all of his share and stakeholders where he said, listen, anytime an organization should focus on creating shareholder value. That's why organizations exist in the first place. But in addition, we have been given a conditional license to operate, and therefore stakeholder management becomes critically important, right? And so I think business schools, other organizations and institutions actually start paying attention, and they have to, right? And so I think maybe that is simply awareness, but I think hopefully and slowly people are moving in that particular direction. Certainly what I see happening at my school is an enormous interest in sustainability issues, right? And so maybe the next generation will put a lot of pressure on leaders in the public, private, and public sector to really take that more into consideration, right? I think that would be absolutely key. I know you will jump on that answer in a second, but I would like to respond to you if I may, because because I introduced earlier those 11 leader character dimensions, right? Accountability and humility and humanity. Those are just words to many people. Of course, you can ask me all kinds of questions. So importantly, what we did in our research is to behavioralize those terms. If we would like people to act with more humility or greater collaboration, what does that mean in behavioral terms? So again, with all those executives, we did that to create a common frame of reference. So when we talk about creating this greater understanding of cultures, I would say absolutely. I think that's really embedded in this notion around collaboration, open-mindedness, humility, love of learning, right? I would say judgment or wisdom, to be always situationally aware, right? That contributes to sound decision-making that will contribute to creating value and prosperity, not only of organizations, but also of nations.
Do you want to jump in here?
I'd have been astonished if a Dutchman didn't get that. It's the home of cultural anthropology. Can I, please? I'm really sorry about this, but I've just got so much to say. Just a 30-second addition to that. I think that we were getting there with that great answer you gave. Basically, the thing that makes this possible is a concept called brand. Brand is the license for any organization to operate, and it's donated by the public. And the public is increasingly finding that world-friendly operations and socially responsible business is a requirement. And since they are requiring it, business has no choice but to comply. And if they don't comply, they don't get the brand value, and without the brand value, they can't operate.
Okay, we'll come back to that. No, that's great. That's a line I want to follow, but I want to give Slav a chance to talk about what I'd asked Sophia. You've been involved in business in Ukraine since the early 90s. You've seen it all in independent Ukraine. Have you seen changes in the leadership in the business environment over the past several years?
Of course, Ukrainians always tell me, I've been there since for 25 years. So in 25 years, I ask them what changes have occurred. Nothing has changed. That's the standard line. And everyone's convinced, and why? Because they don't feel it in their own pocket, and they don't feel it personally. But society has made enormous changes in Ukraine, and business has as well. When I first started to work as a lawyer in Ukraine in 1993, I hate to say it so many years ago, one of the things that when you would be acquiring companies for Western investors, one of the things that the business people on the Ukrainian side would say, well, what are you going to do with the company? Are you going to move it to the United States? Philip Morris, one of my first clients, we were buying a cigarette factory in Kharkiv, and people were so concerned, the Ukrainian business leaders were so concerned that we would move the entire factory and unemploy everybody. They didn't understand the concept of corporate acquisition and what the consequences should be. So I think now Ukrainian business people are much more sophisticated. They have, of course, traveled abroad. They have had greater contact with investors of all kinds. And of course, many of these companies are now private. When I was initially in Ukraine, these were state entities being privatized, and in the process of privatized being made something totally different than Ukrainian society was willing to accept. So the changes have been enormous, and of course, there's still a long way to go. But I think in terms of business, I think there's a definite trend to make these companies more Western in style, or international in style. And of course, responsibility to shareholders, independent directors have all made an enormous difference. Yeah.
May I build upon and respond to Simon about competition? Thank you. You mentioned that 80 years of competition practices. Well, we were not part of this 80 years. That's a very important point. So we are still learning how to compete, that the client is getting better value. Not that we feel better, but the client is in the center. Another thing, we are also learning how to partner. And I will give you an example of IT companies. When we just started Lviv Business School in wonderful 2008, that's the best year to start the business school. In 2009, we came to IT companies which are really good in many cities of Ukraine, but including in Lviv. And we said, why don't we make a training program for your people? And since IT companies are competing for stuff, they said, what do you mean? Do you really mean that we should put our people in one classroom? They will switch companies. So they were not ready to do that. But in 2 years, and we did not start that program in 2009, but in 2 years, they got together, they realized that they need to change a lot in education to really get people they want. They understood that they really need to develop their managers to global standards. And now we have wonderful programs where people from various IT companies are studying together, working together. There is very strong IT cluster, not only in Lviv, but also in Kharkiv. There is one developing in Odessa. There is IT association. So people started to understand that, you know, we can grow the market as a pie together much better, but still competition helps them.
I'm going to make my own observation here, which follows up on this point. I was in Ukraine from 2003 to 2006, and I saw up close and personal the way that the businessmen who controlled economic life in Ukraine wanted to monopolize to the extent they could the resources of the society. That was evident in the fact that until 2000 and late 2005, there was only one 4-star hotel in Kyiv, and that was controlled by the mayor's office. And so they didn't want any competition. Now there are many, many 4-star hotels which demonstrate the type of progress which is absolutely essential for the country to take off. On a similar vein, a major Ukrainian businessman, and I'll be a little bit discreet and not say who it was, told me when I began to work on Ukraine again in 2014 that it was very much in his interest for Ukraine to open up economically, because as the Ukraine economy progressed, yes, his share of the Ukraine economy would drop substantially, but the value of his assets would go up astronomically, which of course is the whole point. In fact, it comes back to Simon's points about global interdependence. We're all connected to each other, and we'll all do better if we find a way to make the competition reasonable. Now, having made that point, Simon, I know you want to come back to brands, and I want to go there too. But before that, you've done work in the good country context about Ukraine's progress. You have this list of countries, this index, and you rank countries. If you talk about how Ukraine has moved up the ladder over the past several years, that would be of use.
Yeah, well, what I won't do, if you don't mind, is give specific data on Ukraine for the simple reason that there are 165 countries in the index, and my memory is not as good as it used to be.
Tell me about it.
I'll tell you. I'll tell you basically how the index works. What we've tried to do is we've tried to create a balance sheet for every country on the planet. In other words, to look for the first time not at how countries perform domestically, but what their contribution is to the rest of humanity and the rest of the planet. And the way that we've done this is by collecting together 35 data sets, which are mostly in the public domain. In fact, they're mostly collected by the UN system. And so we've got 7 categories of contributions that a country might make to the international community. So there are 5 contributions, 5 measurements within the Environment and Sustainability Index. There are 5 in contributions to the international order, peace and security, health and well-being, and so on and so forth. Total 35 indicators. And each country is basically given a ranking on each one of these indicators.
Where do your indicators come from?
They come mostly from the UN system. So it's very, very important to understand that unlike several of the other indexes which I've published over the past years, this is not an opinion poll. This is actually a measurement of national behavior. Of course, it's just a toe in the water. It can't possibly be a complete account of what every country gives to the rest of the world or what it takes away. But it's the beginning of a very interesting conversation. And I know this because I get so much abusive email about it. Every time we publish the annual update, I feel as if I'm truly hated, but I mean truly. And people say to me, it's extraordinary how many people have a country that they love and a country that they hate. And the one that they hate seems to motivate them more strongly. And most of the emails say, you are a worthless piece of crap and you should have been shot at birth. How can you rank country A so high when it's obviously the worst country on earth? And we have a discussion, and it's always a fascinating discussion, and I show where those numbers come from and why it's going up or why it's going down. And then at the end of it, I always say the same annoying thing, which is, thank you for proving to me that this index is doing its job. We've just been having a completely different kind of conversation about this country than the one we would have done before. Instead of constantly asking how well it's doing, we're now asking how much it's doing. And the index clearly cannot provide an answer to that. but it can generate a conversation, and that's what we're trying to do. Let me just say very briefly about Ukraine's position going up or down. It's important not to read too much into the longitudinal movement throughout the index. This is still a very new index. The one I'm releasing tomorrow is the 4th, so it's very young. Whenever you're publishing a ranking of countries, it does take a few years to settle down. You need to find the right data, and consequently the methodology and the data sets which we include are not identical yet from year to year. So changes from one year to another may not be exclusively as a result of changes in the behavior of the country. They may be because we're still tweaking the index. What I'm happy to do, if anybody's interested from Ukraine, is to do a little study that looks at Ukraine's numbers in depth. I would suggest after tomorrow when the new edition is out. And then we can have a look and see whether those changes are significant or not.
Okay, thank you. Let me just do one thing here. There'll be questions, but that'll be in about 15, 20, 30 minutes. Ukraine has moved up the index on the index that has been so far been published, I think from 90 to 70 to 50 over the past several years, demonstrating, in fact, via your index, with all the caveats you just laid down, that in fact the business environment, and for that matter, the social environment in the country is improving. And keep that in mind, those of you who next time read in the newspaper somewhere about quote-unquote corruption in Ukraine, which is a problem, but not the entire...
I'm so sorry, I have to correct you on that.
Please correct me.
What the Good Country Index rankings do not show is anything to do with the business environment within Ukraine.
Okay,
all it shows is that Ukraine is somehow managing to give more to the world outside its own borders than it did before, which is even more important in my opinion.
True, fair enough.
It's a better member of the international community.
Always happy to be corrected when I make mistakes. Okay, now let's come...
Your point's a good one.
That's right. This point is an excellent. Let's come back to your concept of branding. Now, the argument you made before was that branding is a mechanism which will compel, in this case, business leadership to do the right thing. But branding is ultimately, it's a psychological phenomenon, right? It's a reputation. And obviously, businesses do not want a bad reputation. But at the same time, when a business leader his performance or her performance is examined, the shareholders are not asking, what's our reputation? They're asking, what's our bottom line? And reputation only factors in when it's a negative. If I'm wrong, correct me, but that's how it seems to me. So how do you react to that?
I think in the immediate term that may be true. It's not very common for companies to put brand value in their shareholders' report. But in the long term, it's absolutely fundamental, because basically, if you have a weak or a negative brand image in the marketplace, then you're facing continual, very strong headwinds. Basically, there's limited acceptance of what you stand for and your values and your business amongst the public. So over time, if you have a weak or weakening brand image, you'll find it harder and harder to trade and harder to make money for your shareholders. That's the point.
No, that's a very good point. Now let's jump to Gerard, all right? Now, you've been studying business leadership for 10 years, right? Or more. But this latest initiative goes back 10 years. How do you systematize the concept of brand in ways that makes this an imperative for executives? Now, what I just said is too abstract, but let's make it concrete, right? So you're a hard-charging business leader, right? And you have the market is whatever it is, and you have to make a decision. And you know that if you take this element of risk, your chances of profits are greater. But if you do it, you might be in an ethically gray area. Is your incentive to do the quote-unquote, to do the right thing, or to do the profit-making thing and hire PR guys to make your brand safe?
All right. So that's impossible. In 2008, right, in Canada, we had a major story. Food processing company put on the market, unbeknownst to them, obviously, tainted food. 23 Canadians lost their lives. Now, for any organization, that is an ultimate tragedy, right? Let alone for the families. So when this particular CEO found out what was happening, he really did not wait for tests to come back. He basically closed the plant, started to communicate immediately, and took the blame. Like, there are so many questions. How did this happen? Was it really us? But in the eyes of many people, he did the right thing. They had a very strong corporate culture with a set of values or principles, including be transparent, do the right thing, and a bias to action. If I'm a shareholder and I'm looking at what this particular person was doing, I'm getting extremely worried, right? Don't make matters worse by guessing. And there were lots of questions, but in the eyes of many people, he did the absolute right thing. Customers, number one. Shareholders, number two. You don't fool around with public health. And so in the very short term, of course they lost market share, right? And the financials looked terrible. But guess what happened, right? The recovery was very, very quick. Now, I'm part of that organization in terms of, hold on one second, in terms of executive education. I'm following all of this. And when you're part of executive education, you get a nice jacket that says Ivy logo and the logo, right, of the organization on your chest or wherever. So I'm walking one particular day a year later at an airport, and this elderly lady stops me and said, I just want you to know how proud I am of this particular CEO in the organization. Right? And so this whole notion around brand and doing the right thing, even if it may hurt the shareholder in the short term, actually can pay off.
And this CEO survived.
Totally.
Right. But you made the critical point here that the corporate culture pointed him in that direction.
Totally. You know,
how, again, you're the expert. In your estimation, this is presumably not hard data, what percentage of major firms have such a corporate culture?
That they truly, truly live those values.
Or just have it out there for the public to see.
Oh, hold on. And Enron had a very nice value statement. Okay. Right? The question is, can you actually live those in good times, but in particular, listen, anybody can live those values in good times. That's not so difficult. But in a crisis situation, will you live those values? And if you ask me, is that the majority? I would say no, I'm not convinced by any means, right? And so I would say this requires a great deal of personal leadership, leader character, and an incredibly strong organizational culture that cares deeply about the brand and what we stand for.
Do you want to jump in here, Simon?
Yeah, and the biggest danger of all is people believing what you just said, that it's possible to substitute correct behavior with PR. That doesn't work. It generally makes things far worse because people ain't dumb and they can see.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to turn to Sophia. Do you see, is there a Ukrainian component to this conversation? If you don't have to answer, you can just say, please, I'll pass.
No, I think there is a component because I think if business leaders are thinking about their organization not just as in the short term, which I have mentioned in the beginning, we do something, which looks nice and sell, or, we get bottom line quickly. Of course, bottom line really means in business. Otherwise, businesses will not be developing. But still, I think there is still often misunderstanding in Ukraine among business leaders. Can it be fixed? Can packaging hide the real what's inside? And I think some Ukrainian business leaders are still believe that nice packaging can help a lot, and nice PR company with a strong reputation can help a lot. But I think in longer term, I still see a lot of business people who find their mission much longer term than just even maybe their lives. And if you think in those terms, then there will be even more hard decisions, because the longer term you think, more hard decisions you will have to make. And this is the challenge. And our history, we were having yesterday just a conversation, and our history shows that we had, in very complicating times, we had people who stayed with their values, who believed in what they believed, and they kept believing this. And one of the examples can be, well, maybe from different sphere from religion, but that's the biggest underground church which existed in Ukraine in Soviet times, and there were martyrs of this church. And but another example, gave their lives recently. I don't think they have been thinking. I mean, they were just living their values. I don't think they had much time to make decision at all. And those examples, I think they can be taken to other spheres. But how many will be among us like that? I don't know.
I'm going to come back to your point a little bit, but Gerard wants to jump in, and then we can Slava the floor.
Just very briefly. I mean, let's be honest here, right? I mean, if you look at some of those surveys around trust in organizations and trust in CEOs, it is incredibly low, pretty much wherever you are these days, right? And I think to a great extent, that's because leaders or organizations do not live those values. And people become incredibly cynic, and rightfully so. Going back to the leader that I spoke to, remember, 23 Canadians lost their lives. He was elected CEO of the year because of what he did. He stood by his values. Compare or contrast that with the CEOs of organizations like Wells Fargo, Uber, right, or Volkswagen. They all have value statements. That's not the issue. The issue is, can you live those values? Do you have the humility, the humanity, the courage to do what all of us know should be done to right a particular situation? And some do and some don't.
I'm going to come back to that point too. But Slava, I like your comment on, again, the Ukrainian component of this conversation.
One of the reasons the Leadership Academy focuses on responsibility is because there's a sense that the students have gone through Ukrainian high schools haven't had discussion of this. The predominant, over 50% of Ukrainian teachers are products of Soviet pedagogical institutes. And our program actually builds on the essential development of character the parents start children, and that's supposed to continue. The Ukrainian schools do. We stepped in. We focused on responsibility, democratic values, and we want to make sure that our students are in a position to be responsible for the country's decisions, such as Gerard says, by the Executive of Canada and business people. Remember, we provide we're feeder school, provide other organizations that connect the ground. The values have to in life. You can't teach them. It's very if they're and they are faced with a they have to do. So let's see, you have 4 Ukrainian you're up to say what the treatment of
reference and also I'm not a business, but I've developed my entire career in diplomatic service, in the foreign service. This is also in my, and Gerard talked about, by and large, American group, military officers. In a certain seriousness about diplomatic, willing to doing important American national interest. Now that's the news. The not so conversation, comparable ones on the. I'll explain. I mean, certainly it comes from is in a bureaucracy, including in the diplomat. You know where they go. You're a smart person, and you they want you to go. Nothing to do. The problem for you becomes, in a popular phrase, in most cases, unless power, just as it's about going through and diplomats on personal officers who are fearless to the chief of staff, under Secretary of State, and I give you lots to embarrass people. When it comes to your point, when it comes to your point, you as martyr, not necessarily a good individual. You're going to make character and your point absolutely right. Core and ethics, especially. But how do a system behavior going to how do you make jump in?
I think, John, I mean, sector moments. So there's also an interesting loyalty, right? Continue, but his voice in our conversation, back to your personal Canada or Toronto, it used to be the top action is below the reason. Force is a metaphor. If we what we have kind of the character situation, situations where decide my brand. So for me, maybe and
the way that to be ethical, which benefits as being unethical, doing the right thing and self-interest. It might be an organization where you're rewarded for having a to so as opposed to being long-term.
Well, maybe I think this is some Ukrainian companies of your board. Schools in business school, but you have of the board is as an instrument and what we as a country witnessing is communicate important what happens in the 21st. Not give examples, but there you can behave. It's still important.
Internalize the values. Tried at home, but public 10 months intense behave by these values. We're now wondering whether will last until adulthood to make them what was responsible me a country, and that
The question was, how do we put them in. So here's what kind of, I would say, recruit. Believe that leader can leadership profile. Believe that leader can. Number two, especially from leaders, matters, right? Its sense is generation of leaders. We should not right in if they didn't conversation for conversation to can make and recruitment just to really reinforce.
In the academy, every day we have a group sits together and they articulate, because if someone opposes.
And I love this because in a critically important in an organization.
You don't necessarily need again, micro side, your activities, the whole globe. How does it understand question of they get clobbered? Do most, whether civil society, self-interest demand,
particularly a problem in democratic leaders and collaboration. Box and they'll lose the election. That is only interesting. Less and less true with wake up to the in their country participate. There's a certain old that we need to do to change what's traditionally been, and we need that. This kind of leadership. After this meeting, let's see, because I'm serious. Of course, trainers feel they have to go. That's thing one. The good country. Years necessary in order to start shifting the culture.
The logic of your position is very clear, but you sound to me optimistic. And
guilty as charged.
Actually, what I've learned in my career is that a certain amount of optimism is absolutely essential to success. So that's a good thing. Now, but here's my question for you. What you say right now sounds really interesting, although that's a ambiguous word, in light of the rise, the very clear rise over the past several years of populist leaders and their growing importance, at least for the moment. Your comments.
Every morning I bless the good Lord for sending us Donald J. Trump, because he has dramatized this issue in a way that nobody else could have done. He's given the system such a shake-up, and I don't claim that he's done it deliberately. I think it's probably largely accidental, but I think it was entirely necessary. We were saying when we were drinking coffee before the session that Donald J. Trump has made it so much easier for me to explain the good country to taxi drivers, because they now get it. They say, oh, right, like the opposite of what Trump's doing. Thank you. So that's very clear. May I say something about nationalism and populism very briefly? I'm puzzled by this whole idea, right? I'm a globalist, and I'm proud of it. I spend every day worrying about the world and the countries in it. If I felt they were relevant, I'd worry about the other planets, right? That's the kind of person I am. As a consequence of that, I don't worry about my own village where I live. I let it look after itself, okay? So that's me. And then I have other people I know, some in my own family, who are exactly the opposite. They're localists. They spend their whole time worrying about the village in which we live. They don't have time and they don't have the interest to worry about the system. I'm very glad that they're doing that because I'm not. They should be very glad that I'm doing this because they're not. Where did the idea come from that nationalists and globalists should be antagonistic towards each other? Where did the idea come from that these are warring tribes? It's the most illogical idea I've ever come across in the whole of my life. So I think we really have to challenge this every time we see it. And whenever anybody says, you've got two tribes these days in politics and they're going to fight to the death, the inwards and backwards brigade versus the outwards and forwards brigade, this is bullshit. We need to work together because together is the only way we're going to make the thing work.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I'm optimistic. I'm so sorry.
No, no, anyone want to comment on this?
Well, maybe very shortly. What worries me is the percentage of paternalistic expectations in the society. And I think that this is what makes both populists and nationalists play around that. So I think that sometimes, well, maybe your relatives who are worrying about their local community, maybe if that helps them to get rid of those paternalistic expectations, that's really good. You know, because I think that's a big issue for Ukraine now. You know, how to make people feel in charge. How can we feel in charge of what happens around us? How can we feel in charge of our cities? How can we feel in charge of our country and of the whole planet? Because the opposite is that I expect that we will have a good president who will fix everything out, and if he does or she does not do that in a couple of months, then, you know, again, the same story. So I think that awakening up from the grassroots, making people more accountable for what they do, what they see, how they can participate, that's one of the tasks which can actually unite a lot of people.
Okay, we've been talking for almost an hour and a quarter. Does anyone on the panel want to say something else before we turn to the audience? Okay, in that case, Dan, first question.
Thanks very much. Dan Bilak. I'm in sales, but I have to do marketing because I have a brand that's really, really bad. As the government's the Ukrainian government's investment promotion officer, I need to be out pitching companies on a direct level, but I have this overhang that I have to carry with me about the perception of the country and what essentially comes down to the brand. And the brand, as I was fascinated by your analysis, Simon, because and Gerard, especially because, you know, at the end of the day, when we talk about the character, we're talking about trust. And when we talk about the Ukrainian context, about, you know, our character of the leaders especially, and the cynicism that is so deeply ingrained in Ukrainian political culture, still from Soviet times, essentially. Not, you know, the United States is nothing, or any other country, compared to what goes on in post-Soviet countries. So I'm struggling with this. How do I start to change the narrative about the country, especially when it comes to the issues of corruption, which the country has gone way beyond what it was before, but it's still rampant, it's still endemic, and nothing's changed. And you read this in especially people who should know better in the Western press. Yet, I went on to, after we met a few months ago, I went to look at where we are in your brand index. The Good Country Index. 2 years ago, we were 99. We're now with that last year, we were 73, and the last one was 54. I'm really kind of nervous about what you're going to unveil tomorrow. But, you know, I went through the categories as well, because this is all about their indices, but it's also about perception. And isn't it? Well, if it's not, then how do we then use it so that I can actually start to change, and others can change the perception about Ukraine being a good country? Because I think you're really onto something here. I mean, the penny dropped for me, because that's what we should be talking about, is Ukraine as a good country, as a contributor. What I want at the end, and I'll finish with this, is when I talk to investors, when I talk to anybody else about Ukraine, I want people to see Ukraine as a modern, dynamic, Western democracy with a 1,000-year-old European history whose people contribute to global peace, security, and prosperity. How do I do that?
So do it.
Okay, how do I use your global index to help me do this?
Oh, I don't know if that's going to be much help to you. It's not really designed for that purpose. Dan,
Can you redesign it? Can you redesign it? He's really desperate.
Dan, the bottom line is this, that no individual sector of any country has the power to shape the image of the country. The investment promotion agency does not have sufficient influence over national policies to be able to shift perceptions of the country. This is the problem. Now, you can do sales and you can do marketing of the products that you have to sell, the investment opportunities. But in the end, as you've discovered, the sellability of those products is determined by the overall image of the country. So you have to work within the restrictions that imposes upon you. If a country wants to be admired, it has to become admirable. If it wants to be admired more, it has to become more admirable. And that is fundamentally an issue of policies and of grand strategy. It's nothing to do with communications. It's nothing to do with PR. So the only way that a country can raise its profile internationally, can become more admired internationally, is if it's a cross-sectoral effort. This is far too important to be left to the government. It's far too important to be left to business. It's far too important to be left to the population. Nothing less than a functioning collaboration of all three and a grand strategy that answers some very simple questions. What is Ukraine for? Why do we exist? Why should a 13-year-old girl in Tajikistan feel glad that Ukraine is there on the map? This is the way that one has to look at these things. If you want to work your way into the heart of the international community and be a valued partner, and the reputation that you acquire thereby, there are no shortcuts. Propaganda doesn't work internationally. It never has, and it never will. Propaganda, branding, only works if you're in control of all the channels of communication reaching the end user, which internationally you're not. So I think if you're Kim Jong-un and you control pretty much all the information reaching your citizens, you can sell them a story which they will eventually believe in, more or less. But internationally, it's never worked and it never can. Oh, Philip of Macedon did a pretty good job on Greece, but that was a long time ago and things were different, right? So today, what you need to do is you need to have not a brand strategy, but a grand strategy that says, why does Ukraine exist? What is our gift to the world? Why should a random person in Uruguay feel glad that Ukraine exists? And work towards that with every sector, through policy, but projects and investments and behavior. It's going to take 5 to 10 years before you even start to notice a difference. But the difference is phenomenal, because what it actually does is it reduces by up to 75% the cost of generating business. It gives you foreign investment, tourism, cultural relations, productive diplomatic relations at a rate that you couldn't possibly conceive of with a weak or negative reputation. So that's the only answer I've ever come across in 25 years of trying to do this. There are no shortcuts, I'm sorry to say. But if you get all of the stakeholders together and you have a serious conversation about the long-term role of the country in the world, then things start to change almost immediately.
I'm Andrzej Cymbal, managing partner of KPMG in Ukraine. Is this working? Yes. Okay, good. Well, the topic of this panel is character and leadership, and there was a lot of thoughts and talk about this. Now, the topic of the World Economic Forum is shaping the global architecture in the age of fourth industrial revolution. We at KPMG do the annual survey of CEOs of global companies, asking them, what risks and what characteristics in leadership they feel the most relevant in the current environment. Now, according to the most recent survey that we've conducted, global CEOs believe that agility is the most important characteristics that global leaders must possess, i.e. ability to adapt quickly, in a changing environment. And again, I think this is very important in the age of fourth industrial revolution. Yeah, how do you adapt, to changing competitive landscape? How do you adapt to what the competitors do? And how do you actually stay ahead of the competition? Yeah, in the age of fourth industrial revolution. So my question, if I may ask each panelist, just very quickly to comment whether you agree or not that agility is the key characteristics of today's and tomorrow's leaders.
Sure, if I can start. A great question. We just actually, out of the Ivy School, as a leading business school, of course, focused on disruption. So globally, we had all these roundtables and interviews with senior executives in the public, private, not-for-profit sector, and we asked them a number of questions. A, what do you see happening by way of disruptions, political, economic, technical, whatever it is? B, how well are you prepared to deal with those disruptions? Like, what are you doing right now to get ready? see what are the leadership requirements in order to handle that well, and fourth, what are the implications for business schools going forward. And so it was, to me, remarkable how often people, not explicitly, but implicitly talked about leadership and the importance of leader character. You know, think about disruption. You know, many of the problems of our times, whether this is clean energy or climate, cannot be solved by the government alone or businesses alone. It all requires collaboration to come together and start working on finding solutions, right? This notion around learning, which is absolutely essential. I mean, here, one of the themes of Ukraine House is creativity and innovation. I think people need to bring an immense amount of humility to make that happen. Courage was often mentioned to actually make those big bets and go forward. So when you talk to kind of agility and how to respond to disruption, I think leadership and leader character in particular plays a dominant role, or at least some of those key dimensions we have been talking about this morning. Absolutely.
You know, we deal with adolescents. Obviously, we're very quick thinking and change topics all the time. Agility in a sense of swiftness is not something that we want them to adopt at this point. We want them to be reasonable, to understand, to reason through an idea and bring it to the end. But flexibility and being understanding and tolerant of other points of view, and understanding other points of view, and being understanding how they can be implemented, you know, is very important for us. So that's what we focus on. I think agility, swiftness will come later on, but at this point, it's the reasonableness and the flexibility. And the tolerance is important.
I think it's possibly asking an unreasonable question to rank these characteristics. I think they shouldn't be ranked. I think leadership is a network of values, all of which have more or less equal importance and are interconnected.
You might want to read Gerard's article on leadership with judgment in the center. I remember that, very interesting.
Thank you for the shameless plug. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I think I can relate because if you look at the model of character, leadership, judgment is in the middle. And I think our whole conversation, even here, goes about decisions. That leadership, it's not about just conversation, it's about real life and about decisions. So I think it goes very much in line with what you have been saying. And the whole world now can be explained by very simple and complicating word, complexity. So all of that leads to how do we manage this complexity? How do we not lose ourselves? How do we lead people in a way that this complexity is not rotten, but becomes a little bit better?
I'm Igor Shevchenko, and I want to offer a comment as a young global leader of the World Economic Forum and as a former member of the government of Ukraine, the previous government, and as a candidate for the president. Ukrainian House is a good place in the center of universe, in the center of Earth this week, and I know that Ukrainian House should show the best, parts of Ukraine, but, I want to tell you the truth. I'm very sorry for Daniel because he has a very tough job. He has to sell not a very good product. I'm sorry, but Ukraine internally not a very good product to sell, and we want to do whatever we can to show the, international community the best of Ukraine, to bring investments and so on and so forth. But we need to do a lot of homework. We need to solve a lot of internal problems before we can offer the world something. We have, as Daniel said, rampant corruption, and I don't see any improvements. You said that Ukraine becomes a better citizen of the world. Maybe from the outside you see it's better, but in the inside, the state becomes worse for its own citizens, that's for sure. So it's kind of a comment. We need to do a lot of internal work, and we need to change our leadership in Ukraine, because the current leadership, it's maybe better than the previous one, and it does a good job as externally. It hires good PR specialists. Many of the leadership speaks English. They can say in English a lot of good things, but we still have a lot of problems.
Igor, so we situate you properly. You say you worked for the last government. You mean the Yanukovych government?
No.
You
the previous government after,
mean
after the
on the
revolution.
Yatsenyuk?
Yatsenyuk. In the
I
second
see.
government of Yatsenyuk, yes. I was a
Okay.
Minister of Ecology and Natural Resources.
Oh, okay, right. But just one other question. So are you saying things have gotten better or they've not gotten better over the past few years?
It's better, yes, it's better. But it's not real reforms. Unfortunately, it's just cosmetic changes. It's better in certain specific areas, yeah, I admit it, but...
You don't think the changes in the gas sector are fundamental and positive?
But we have to change the system. We still
Yeah,
have...
just answer my question.
Yes,
Okay,
yes,
good.
I agree with you, but we
Okay.
have to change the whole system. We still have oligarch-corrupt system. It's really, the whole system is driven by oligarchs and corruption. That's what I'm going to say, you know. We have to change it. We have to start with this. We have to start with law and order. Everything, you know, will go faster if we return law and order in the country, because economy cannot work properly if there is no law and order. So that's what Lee Kuan Yew did in Singapore. You know, he started with corruption. If we still have corruption in government, we don't have, you know, very good conditions for business. I speak, you know, yesterday I spoke with a lot of business people, and they say we left Ukraine. We literally left Ukraine several years ago, like 1 year ago, because of corruption on customs, corruption in other state agencies. So, sorry, but this is the truth.
Okay, you've had your say. Other questions or comments?
Can I respond to that one?
Oh, please. Yes, of course.
Just a quick thought. This notion that Ukraine has too many domestic problems to be worrying about the international community, I think is a very, very dangerous narrative. What I'm saying is that there is a form of governance which simultaneously respects your domestic and international requirements and responsibilities. This is the way that every country must go now. I hear more and more governments all the time saying to me, we'll leave this to the countries that have got something to boast about, which is the same 12 countries that have been trying to support the multilateral system for the past 100 years, and 12 isn't enough. My argument is this, that there's a new form, a gold standard of policymaking, of domestic policymaking, that integrates domestic and international responsibilities. There is absolutely no need for a country to say, no excuse for a country to say, we've got too many problems to worry about the planet. You also live on the planet, and as an ex-Minister of Ecology, you don't need me telling you that. The international system is in a very, very bad shape at the moment, and it is essential that countries work on their own domestic issues and their international responsibilities simultaneously. This is the kind of technology leap, we were talking about this before in the context of competition, which countries like Ukraine should perceive as a wonderful opportunity. Right now, you could be better than the traditional internationalist countries by combining those two operations, by serving the world and by serving yourselves, by working and collaborating with other countries and treating the whole business of foreign affairs as not something extraneous to what you do at home, but as part of the whole message. I think it's tremendously important that we don't have this idea that the rest of the world can wait till we're sorted. If every country waits until they're sorted before they help the world, it'll be too late. It already is too late.
Okay, give Dan a chance to respond, and then Paul. Oh, but Slav, you want to speak too? No. Okay.
We have a problem in Ukraine of always trying to make the perfect the enemy of the good, which is, I think, Simon's last point. Actually, you heard what I said was I rejected the notion that corruption is rampant and endemic and everything else, and I think that over the last 2 years, especially, it has been significantly minimized, and the scope for corruption, which is actually much more important long-term than throwing people in prison, which is actually what hasn't happened. People want justice, and they haven't seen that, and that's what drives this notion of a lack of corruption. But in terms of corruption prevention, we arguably have now, today, the most transparent, open system of public finances in the world. I can't breathe without having to do a tender. It's really frustrating, I have to tell you. But I think that we always also have to know, and it comes in a sense to your point, Simon, that these policies that we have been pursuing, we had a near-death experience 5 years ago. Lost 20% of our GDP, 60% of the value of our currency, 7% of our territory, and we had $5,000 US in the government's bank account. I mean, it was what has happened over the course of the last 5 years. It's like trying to build an aircraft carrier well at sea with a handful of competent engineers in the middle of a hurricane while you're under fire. And we're still afloat. And I don't think any country in the world has done more to transform its society and economy than Ukraine has in the last 5 years. My point was that because of a lot of external factors, some of it is the perception and of the corruption, the character of our leaders, the war in the East has a huge impact, probably the overriding impact, and the fact that our neighbor spends $1 billion a year screwing us throughout the media of the world. And unfortunately, many people, both in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, who are quote-unquote friends of Ukraine, feed that unwittingly. And so the issue that I came to is we started the policies, we're doing good things, we're still not there. It's an iterative process, a process of transformation. How do you work? It's not PR, but it is communication to get, what are the touch points that we can use internationally to actually get our message across that we are a force for good. This is why I'm so attracted to this concept, is because we are doing good things. We send our soldiers in Afghanistan, we go to all sorts of other places. We're part of the climate change, we're trying to bring clean energy, et cetera, et cetera. How do we go about doing this?
He wants an answer to that question. Oh gosh, okay. I'm just trying to condense 6 or 7 hours into a few seconds. Basically, doing the right things.
We don't have enough vodka here to have this conversation.
I function better without vodka. Doing the right things is not sufficient unless those things are noticeable and relevant to people in other countries. Sending soldiers to Afghanistan is presumably praiseworthy, even though it involves killing people, which call me old-fashioned. I don't think that's necessarily a good idea, but nonetheless, it's perceived to be the right kind of thing to do. It's also what every other country does, and why should you be surprised if people don't notice it? My simple recipe, which I've evolved over the last 20-odd years, is strategy, substance, and symbolic actions. So you need a grand strategy, the thing I mentioned before. Where are we going? Why do we exist? If the hand of God should slip on the celestial keyboard at 3 a.m. tomorrow and delete Ukraine, heaven forbid, who would miss you and why, right? What is your utility, your indispensable utility to the international community? That's strategy. Substance, having decided what is your gift to the world, what is the set of things or the one thing that you are uniquely able to contribute to life on Earth, you then do that with massive substance over a prolonged period. And then symbolic actions is you do that in ways that capture attention. And these things are self-communicating. I remember the Irish government, for example, offering a zero tax rate for poets, authors, and dramatists back in the 1960s. A perfect symbolic action. It wasn't a PR stunt, it was a real piece of policy. It was fiscal policy, it cost them some money. Not a lot, because those guys don't earn anything, but unless it's Bono, who did try to apply for it and was rightly rejected. But these kinds of things, it's like Catalonia banning bullfighting to prove that it wasn't the same place as Spain. These are the things that need to be done because they grab attention. And in the age of social media, the social media will promote what you do if it's sufficiently relevant and magical that people notice it. It has to be relevant to their lives, and it has to be magical. If you do that, you don't need to spend a cent on advertising or public relations. Hiring a PR agency, I want to apologize for the PR people in the room, is basically what you do if you've given up on having good ideas, right? You bribe somebody to force stories down the throats of an unwilling journalist. If you've got a good story, you don't have to force it. The journalists want it. They'll be dragging it from you, and the social media particularly. So don't spend any money on marketing. It's a shocking waste of taxpayers' money. Great. That's the best situation to be in because it means you're forced to be creative about it. I think governments that spend taxpayers' money on marketing their country shouldn't just not be in power, they should be in jail.
Yeah, exactly.
Good morning, my name is Paul Gride. I'm the president of the Ukrainian World Congress. We've been talking about the country of Ukraine and its citizens. Well, there is a diaspora of 20 million people living outside of Ukraine, and that's the group that I'm focused on. And over the last several decades, the Ukrainian communities around the world have been teaching leadership, have been raising people like myself who've grown up in the diaspora to become leaders, become local leaders, but also global leaders. And one of the things that I think I personally find very, very frustrating is when people get up and say, it's the fault of the government, and turn around and say, well, until we have a change in government, then nothing will change. And I'm sorry, but that's a very defeatist attitude. Because not only will that attitude of saying we need to change the government for change to happen, that actually disincents people from wanting to do anything. And I'd like to get your comments on, because I think that what's really important, especially what we're teaching our young, what I call Ukrainian diaspora, is that sense of responsibility. To be good corporate citizens, but that sense of responsibility not only to themselves, their family, their local communities, but also to a global community, and also to help to build a new Ukraine. And I'd like to get your comment on how do we build that sense of responsibility? Because I find that very frustrating, especially in Ukraine, because that's the system that unfortunately have people been raised in, that someone else in Kyiv has to make all the decisions and fix all the problems.
I'm going to pass that question straight on to the other panelists. All I'm going to do is tell you you're right. These guys will tell you how to do it.
Yeah, I think I was, this is exactly what I meant when I was talking about paternalistic, expectations of the societies. We see it a lot. Well, in Ukrainian Catholic University, what we see is that we should become the university which is serving. And this word of serving is becoming more and more in our language now. And this is more and more in the language which we speak with our students, which means that every single person who studies in our university should be working on various projects, on community service, or anything which can bring back to the society while they are still students. And this is something which we put as a goal for us as a university, that it has to be everybody who studies at UKU should be a part of that process. And I think this is one of the examples. Unfortunately, I don't know how many other universities would be ready to take this as an approach, but we are ready to share our experience in that.
And we, of course, do that at the Leadership Academy, Paul. Responsibility is our hallmark. We try to give the students the leadership skills they need to be able to be responsible citizens of their own community. I think in Ukraine, there's something that's happening that's interesting. The decentralization is forcing responsibility to a lower level in the government. People are no longer turning to Kyiv to answer, but they're looking to themselves, and they have the funding to be able to do some things. So as a fund, we're working with local leaders as well, trying to help them figure out how to implement the programs they want to do without going to Kyiv, but doing it on the local level.
Okay, I'd like to thank the panel for a very interesting conversation, and thank Ian Ignatovic for sponsoring this, and Alexis Japisky for putting this all together. And thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
I wouldn't have expected anything less. Anyways, good to see you. Good to see you again. Yeah. That was really good. That was really good.
We need a longer conversation.
We absolutely.
Of course.